The Employees and Expenses drop-down menu provides access to all expense-related information. To access expense items, first select Expenses, then click the Expense Items menu option. As you can see here, we have no outstanding expense items. To create an expense item, click the Create button and select Expense Item. Cash expense items are created for expenses that have not been incurred using a company-issued credit card. Cash expense items are also created for mileage reimbursements or food expenses, including advanced food allowance requests. To start, select the date of the expense. Next, select the project and cost codes associated with the expense. In our example, we will create an expense item to get reimbursed for parking at a garage that did not accept American Express. Next, enter a description to identify the nature of the request. Always remember that expense descriptions are viewable by owners, so be sure to provide as much detail as necessary to identify the business purpose of the expense. It is very important to attach receipts to every expense item, especially for out-of-pocket charges. As you can see here, you may drag and drop a scanned image, or you can attach a receipt from the receipt store. We'll use the receipt store, as it will automatically transfer the amount of the receipt into our expense item. Finally, we must identify the expense category, which, in this case, is car miscellaneous. Once we have entered all of the details, we can click Create to finish the process. We can see that our new expense item now displays in the expense item list. Let's create another expense item, and investigate the additional options available for mileage and food expenses. Mileage reimbursements are submitted by individuals who do not receive an auto allowance, or in special situations where an auto allowance does not apply. To create a mileage expense item, first select the Mileage Radio button. Mileage is reimbursed at the current federal rate per mile, in effect on the date the travel occurred, so we must first select a date in order to view the mileage rate. We now see the rate, and can complete the expense item by filling in the mileage field. Let's take a quick look at the options available when creating a food expense item. As with the Mileage Radio button, selecting the Food Radio button displays fields unique to that expense type. In this case, we see that the expense date has been transferred into the start date field for the food allowance request. We can supply an end date for our food allowance request that spans the maximum allowable date range according to policy. You may indicate if the allowance should include family members, as well as whether weekend days should be included in the calculation. Be sure to refer to the standard operating procedure for current policy guidelines. Click Create when finished. As with all expense items, we must identify the project and cost codes, as well as enter a description of the item. Attempting to create an item without this information will generate a message at the top of the screen. We will use the Last Cost Code button to select the codes from our previous entry, then enter a description for the item. Finally, we will create the item. Creating expense items is the first of two steps needed for reimbursement. Step 2 involves adding your expense items to a check request. Let's see how multiple expense items are associated with a single check request. To create a check request, first select Expenses, then click the Check Request menu option. We see here that we still have one outstanding check request in our queue. We're going to create a new check request from scratch, using the Create button. Check requests allow you to combine multiple expense items into one reimbursement. Check requests are also created to reimburse individuals for living expenses, such as rent and utilities, as well as auto allowances. We will review living and auto expenses in a subsequent module. For now, we will create a check request to cover the two expense items we have created. As before, create an appropriate description for the check request, then click Create. We must now add the previously created expense items to our request. To start, click Add Item, then select each of the expense items you would like this expense check to cover. Once you have selected all of the appropriate items, you must click Add Selected Items to add the items to the request. Clicking Save Changes will not add the items, so be careful to always click Add Selected Items. If for whatever reason, You wish to remove an item that has been added, or check to see if your items have actually been added to your check request, simply scroll to the bottom of the check request, select the item in question, then click Remove Selected Items. In our case, we will leave both items as is. We will save our changes without submitting our request. As we can see here, 2 check requests are pending in our queue. Clicking the checkbox next to the request allows us to submit the request for processing. Alternatively, we can submit the request using the Submit button on the Basics tab, as shown here. Submitted requests may be unsubmitted if the request has not yet been processed. Now that we've submitted the request, we can see that the status of the request has changed to indicate that the request is processing. One very important thing to remember is that the Submit button must be used to submit check requests for processing. Failing to do so will delay payment. You must also remember that you will not be able to submit a check request if you have any credit card charges that have not been properly coded, along with the project and cost code, and submitted for processing. If you realize this is the case, be sure to go back and code any outstanding credit card charges, then return to the check request to complete the submission. Always check to see if all selected expense items have been properly added to your check request. The easiest way is to scroll to the bottom of the check request screen and see if your items are listed. If not, click Add Items, select your items, then click Add Selected Items to complete the process. Finally, always check the SOP for the most up-to-date expense policy information.